What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of the COTACast. I'm Brian Bermudez, and I'm the host of the Craft of the Air podcast, the aviation podcast that really just expands your knowledge. In each and every episode, join me and my guests as we explore the untold world of aviation together. I'm so glad that you guys are tuned in for another episode. We just couldn't wait on this one. So much happening in aviation. They say aviation is the safest form of travel. The numbers prove it, but safety doesn't happen by chance. It's engineered, inspected, and defended, and behind every smooth landing, it's an invisible world, really. We have torque wrenches clicking at 3 a.m., signatures in logbooks, and inspectors who refuse to look the other way, mechanics working against the clock in hangars that never sleep, and passengers really only see the polished safety briefings and the cabin lights. What they don't see is this constant struggle between safety and scheduling and profit and people and silence and speaking up. And here's the truth. The world only, this hidden world of aviation, it only makes headlines when something goes wrong. A panel tears away at 16,000 feet. A cabin fills with toxic fumes, a lithium battery bursting into flames, a wheel rolling down a runway. Each story different, but each pointing to the same reality. Cracks are forming in the very system that promised us a safe sky. And over the past 6 months, that hidden world has been forced into the spotlight. And what we've seen should make every passenger, every mechanic stop and ask, are we protecting aviation's safety record, or are we gambling with it? And we cover all these stories and all the madness happening in aviation. First things first, this episode of the COTACast is brought to you by Craft of the Air. Grounded by maintenance delays, overwhelmed by aviation's complexity, at Craft of the Air, we don't just solve problems, we keep you flying. For owners and operators, scheduled maintenance to AOG emergencies, COTA delivers precision, reliability, and speed. Our certified experts know every hour your aircraft sits on the ground costs you time and money, and we're here to get you back in the air. Aviation projects can feel like a maze of regulations, contracts, and technical challenges. COTA Consulting is your compass. We provide clear, tailored solutions from pre-purchase inspections to project management so your operations run smoother, faster, smarter. For students and future A&P students, your training for your A&P exams, Cram by COTA is more than a study tool. It's a launch pad. Led by certified professionals, our program breaks down the toughest materials, giving you the confidence and skills you need to ace your exams and start your career strong. Crafted Air isn't just a service, it's your partner, your personal aviation assistant. You're going to have to check out the website. Visit www.craftedair.com. Again, that's www.craftedair.com. Crafted Air, where every project takes flight. So, first things first, it begins with a sound that no passenger really ever wants to hear. It is deafening blast at 16,000 feet. A door plug panel on an Alaska Airlines 737 MAX 9 blew off mid-flight, leaving a gaping hole in the fuselage. Investigation revealed missing bolts. Yeah, paperwork lapses and stories of employees pressured to look the other way. So now the FAA is now proposing a $3.1 million fine. But let's be clear. This fine isn't just one plug. This is about a system that has allowed the quality to slip through the cracks. It really sounds like the FAA is playing catch up rather than leading. Too often regulators react after a failure has already occurred, and they investigate, they issue fines, but those fines are just really a drop in the bucket compared to, the profits at stake. The system only truly works when mechanics and engineers act as the first line of defense, not Washington. And I'll tell you, I've certainly been there, torque wrench in one hand, logbook in the other, got a supervisor leaning in on you saying, just get it signed off. Just get it done. That moment ties your stomach into knots. It's because it's not just ink on a paper. That at that point it's a choice between doing what's right or doing what's easy. And when do employees feel pressured to look the other way? Silence. Silence is what kills. When you make it impossible for a mechanic to say this isn't right, you're not just risking one aircraft. You're corroding the entire safety net of that aviation company or that system at that point. Paperwork isn't busy work, so to say. In aviation, paperwork is the aircraft's memory. Every signature is a fingerprint on its history. When that process is corrupted, the safety net really begins to unravel. The truth is that you can't regulate culture. Boeing has manuals that are thicker than phone books. But if the shop floor says speed before safety, all those manuals are worthless at that point. Fines won't fix that. Oversight won't fix that because silence in aviation maintenance is corrosive. When mechanics are pressured into silence, that silence becomes the most dangerous element in aviation. And when you think about it, if Boeing, with all its oversight, can cut corners, what does that say about the rest of the industry as a whole? A small general aviation shop might actually be safer if their mechanics are empowered, while the billion-dollar company collapses when shortcuts become the routine. You know, the key is really the culture. The culture is really what matters more than the size. Until mechanics and inspectors are empowered to say this isn't right, we'll keep seeing the same cycle of, disaster, investigation, fine, and repeat. You know, and if Boeing, the largest aircraft manufacturer in America, can cut corners under the FAA's nose, what does that say about the oversight across the entire industry? You can argue that the FAA is being reactive, not proactive, because it often takes a near disaster to uncover systematic issues. Now, if the cracks can show at the top of the food chain at Boeing under the FAA's nose, then what about the dangers that don't leave debris on the runway? The threats that don't make the front page of the news because they're invisible. Not every danger explodes at an altitude. Some creep in quietly and through the very air passengers breathe. They're called fume events, where we have toxic oils and chemicals that are leaking into the cabin air conditioning system. There's no alarms, no warnings, just a haze, a smell, nausea, dizziness. Pilots, flight attendants have collapsed mid-flight. Pilots have landed disoriented, passengers often never knowing it even happened. On Airbus A320s, reports of fume events have been spiking. But when you look at it, airlines are often downplaying them, calling them odor events, because if they refer to this as a bad air in the cabin, that really just doesn't look good for press releases, right? But here's the bigger problem. These events are usually underreported. So crews may not even recognize the symptoms until hours later. There's even some reports that some are discouraged from logging them at all. But for the people breathing it in, this isn't PR, it's health, it's safety. The bleed air system is designed, it's supposed to keep contaminants out. But when it fails, when this bleed air system fails, that system becomes a real threat. And when you think about it, the fixes, they get delayed. They get delayed because they cost money. When airlines don't want to ground an aircraft because it's something that's hard to prove, and it's something that has been going on for quite some time. And we see spikes in the A320 family of aircraft very recently, but certainly something that has been occurring for quite some time. You know, it, the system is designed to protect, but the same plumbing that keeps the cabin breathable air in under failure, it'll deliver toxins, and directly into the lungs of everybody on board. And of course, it's certainly probably happened to many of you before. You've probably flown through contaminated cabin air and you've never knew it. The odds are it was probably not officially reported. You know, it's a lot to unfold. The quiet hazards of those types of things. When the system hides these types of incidents, people lose trust. And airlines like to downplay these incidents, rebranding them as odor events. Why? Because it's cheaper to slap a label on a smell than to retrofit an entire bleed air system. But the reality is, for the crews breathing it in, that odor isn't just a nuisance. That could become a long-term neurological damage. So you really have to ask, are we just waiting for catastrophe to happen before taking this seriously? Because history tells us aviation often doesn't take charge until after a tragedy has occurred. If we already know that flight attendants and pilots are getting sick, then the system has already failed. Let's be honest. The warning sign shouldn't be a headline. It should be a mechanic's logbook entry, one that sparks action instead of being ignored. Now, could maintenance crews stop these events at the source? To a point, yes. Aircraft engineers, we can inspect seals, we could check oil systems, document, what we find. But the truth is that, without transparency and investment from airlines, our hands are tied. Mechanics can't fix what an operator refuses to acknowledge exists. So, if toxic air is the damage that creeps in quietly, then the next threat is one that it announces itself in smoke and flame. It's a hazard that we don't bring into the aircraft by mistake. We carry it on board by the hundreds. Yes, tucked into our pockets, our backpacks, overhead bins, and then there's a fire that you can douse with words alone. Lithium ion batteries. They're in our laptops, our phones. The kids have the vapes with them, right? The tablets, the e-bikes, phones, power banks. They carried onto the aircraft by the dozen. And just in the past year, the FAA has logged a huge spike in in-flight incidents, batteries overheating, swelling, even bursting into flames. And in cabins and cargo holds, in overhead bins, it's everywhere on the aircraft. It's so much happening. The lithium ion batteries are a real danger because they don't necessarily act as jet fuel will. The jet fuel waits for a spark. Lithium creates its own. It goes into what's called thermal runaway, a chain reaction so violent that it could turn a carry-on bag into a blowtorch in just seconds. So, the burden falls not so much on, preventing batteries themselves. That's impossible. But on the systems that we maintain, smoke detectors in cargo holds, fire suppression bottles that are charged and ready, cockpit warnings that are armed. These are things that cannot break. These lines of defenses have to be working at all time. One weak link and the system will collapse. And when you think about it, lithium ion batteries could be the next ticking time bomb in aviation. I'd say yes. But there is certainly a twist. It's not just, it isn't like a structural crack or an engine failure. This threat is carried on board by passengers themselves. And in flights, we could have hundreds of potential ignition sources. So the mindset really has to change. We can't eliminate them, but we have to contain and control. Think about it this way. it's lithium ion batteries are the new jet fuel. They're dense, powerful, they're everywhere. But as I said before, unlike jet fuel, they're unpredictable. They don't sit quietly in tanks. They travel in pockets and backpacks. You and so much that can go into preventing these onboard fires as a result of these lithium ion batteries. It's a lot. Each cell, when we look at a battery itself, each cell, it holds energy into these tightly packed layers. There's an anode, a cathode, and they're separated by just something that's a few microns thick. So when that separator fails due to heat damage, overcharging, the electrolyte will instantly ignite. One cell catches fire, it sets off to the next, and then what we have, thermal runaway. Thermal runaway, these temperatures will run well past 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit in a couple of seconds. Now picture that inside an overhead bin. The fire is, self-sustaining. You can't starve it of oxygen. The reaction produces its own. You can't cool it easily. That's why regulators banned bulk shipments of lithium ion batteries on passenger flights years ago. A single pallet could take down an aircraft itself. Big problems there. And a bigger problem, the rules never caught up to the scale of what passengers carry now. In the 1980s, a flight might have had, a few laptops. Today, a 737 with 180 passengers might easily have over 1,000 lithium cells in the cabin. Phones, tablets, headphones, vapes, e-bikes. Maybe not, FAA has data, 50 plus lithium incidents in 2024 alone. And most of them starting in the carry-ons alone, carry-on bags themselves in the cabin. So when I say we're gambling, it's with people's lives, it's not drama, it's a reality. We're betting every single flight on smoke detectors triggering instantly, fire bottles deploying without delay, a cabin crew being fast enough with contaminate bags, systems that must work the first time every time, because with lithium you don't really get a second chance. The next step in this whole thing is it has to be to innovation, fireproof contamination bags, rethinking how batteries are packed, maybe even new rules on how passengers carry them. I don't know. But just right now, every departure carries on a hidden gamble. Hundreds of batteries packed into an aluminum tube traveling at 35,000 feet. So on one side, we've got, these futuristic threats, batteries small enough to fit in your pocket, powerful enough to burn through an aircraft floor. And then on the other side, aviation can still be undone by the most basic failures imaginable. Not high tech, not hidden chemistry, just nuts, bolts, and torque. Huh? In July, passengers on a SpiceJet turboprop watched in fear as the wheel detached and rolled away mid-flight. And, mid-flight, mid-takeoff, I mean. The video went viral within a couple of hours. Luckily, no one was hurt. But here's the thing. Wheels don't just fall off airplanes. For a mechanic, that image instantly raises questions. Was it a missing cotter pin? Was it a torque error, a rushed inspection? Every mechanic knows the devil is in the details. And in aviation, details are everything. See, people imagine that we have these high-tech systems. We have the engines, the avionics, the hydraulics. And these are where the big failures lurk, right? But really, when you think about it, it's often the smallest jobs that make or break safety. Tightening a nut, torquing a bolt, sliding a cotter pin, and bending it just right. How does a wheel, one of the most basic visible components on an aircraft, fall off? It's not magic. It's mistorque. It's a cotter pin not installed. It's a checklist rushed. It's a double check skipped. Here's the bigger truth. When you torque a wheel nut, you're not just tightening metal. You're stretching a bolt like a spring, building tension that holds thousands of pounds of force steady under the landing impact. And a cotter pin isn't just a cheap piece of wire. It's a mechanical fuse, sort of say, that locks that preload into place, preventing vibration from backing off the nut during thousands of cycles. Missing either of those, and you're asking for a 30,000-pound machine to ride on sheer luck at that point. In aviation, luck always runs out. That's why redundancy isn't just, electrical systems or hydraulics, it's procedural. It's the second set of eyes on a torque wrench. It's the inspector who verifies the pin. Safety is engineered into hardware, yes, but also engineered into human systems of accountability. And this is where the culture shows itself again. Because, yes, a mechanic may have missed something, but what environment that allowed them to miss this? What was the environment that allowed this miss to leave the hangar or the gate? A healthy system catches human errors. A broken system will multiply them. I'll tell you that. And this isn't just about one wheel on a spice jet. This is about a bigger truth. Mechanics are human. We make mistakes. But when the culture is rushed, when second checks are treated as wasted time, when the basics are undervalued, that's when human error escapes into the skies. The lesson every mechanic should take is simple but heavy. Never underestimate the basics. The cotter pin that you almost forgot, the torque wrench that you didn't recheck, all of those details carry life and death weight. When you think about it, in aviation, there's really no such thing as a small job. There's no small job. Every detail matters. Every step matters. And the day that we forget that, the wheel comes off. This isn't just wheels. Even the aircraft we think of as being so rugged and reliable, and these workhorses, they're not immune. When the smallest crack forms in the wrong place, it doesn't just care if you're a flying passenger in a jet or a tourist in a helicopter. Physics make no exception. Now, it's so much really happening here. Helicopters aren't really immune from making the headlines in aviation. Recently, the FAA issued a directive for Airbus EC-130 helicopters after cracks were discovered at the root of their tail rotor blades. Now, to really understand why this matters, you got to know what the component does. The tail rotor isn't just a fan on the back of the helicopter. It's sort of a counterweight to the main rotor's torque. And every time the main rotor begins to spin, lifts the aircraft. The fuselage wants to spin in the opposite direction. So the tail rotor fights that. It provides sort of anti-torque thrust so the helicopter can stay straight, turn, or hover. Now, think about the stresses at the root of each tail rotor blade. Every rotation puts the blade under these centrifugal forces measured in tons, really. And they're pulling outward like it's trying to rip the blades right off the hub. You add torsion from our pitch changes, bending from crosswinds, and vibration from the drive system, and you've got one of the most punishing environments in aviation mechanics. This is why the tension torsion bar and the blade root are so critical. They carry the load of every rotation, every maneuver, every gust of wind. So, a crack here isn't cosmetic. It's a structural cancer. Once it starts, it grows with every cycle until the metal gives. Now, for a second, to the public, that might sound like a minor technical note, but to anyone who's ever worked around a rotorcraft, a small fissure in the rotor blade is like a loaded gun. In a flight, that minor crack can become catastrophic in seconds. So inspections are mandatory. Mechanics around the world will be sliding mirrors and flashlights into tight corners, measuring tolerances, logging hours, because this isn't, this when you think about this situation with these Airbus helicopter, this is where lives can be saved quietly long before the skids leave the ground, you know. And there is a bigger issue at hand. What does that mean when the same defect keeps coming back in the logbook, keeps occurring? We keep seeing it. That's a symptom we all know as pencil whipping. You know, clearing a snag on a paper without actually addressing the root cause. It's the difference between putting a band-aid on a wound and actually treating the infection. And this isn't a rare occurrence. It happens when operators, push dispatch reliability over recertification. When management wants the aircraft in the air at any cost, snags become just make it go away with paperwork. So what does that really mean when we have this? It's pressure, pure and simple. Why would engineers pencil whip a work order or skip a safety step? It's pressure from the clock, pressure from targets. Management breathing down your neck. And the truth is, every shortcut borrowed from today becomes an accident built to tomorrow. What's the real cost of ignoring those repeat write-ups? Is trust. Passengers don't see the logbooks, but the regulators do. And once regulators lose faith in the airline's maintenance culture, that fallout is brutal. Grounded fleets, heavy fines, reputations that take decades to build, wiped out in just a couple of weeks. And it's so much so. And sometimes when we look at things, in this case it's a bolt, we had a blade, batteries. Sometimes cracks will run through the entire system. After the fatal crash of Air India flight 171, investigators uncovered something far more troubling than a single mechanical failure: a culture of repeated defects. Logbooks told the truth. Same snags written up, cleared, then written up again. Engineers skipping safety steps. Paperwork signed, completed when the work wasn't actually done. This isn't about one broken airplane. This is about a pattern, a maintenance culture where good enough had replaced airworthy. Regulators forced to step in, sweeping audits, right? And demanding proof that the aircraft were safe, not just on paper, but in reality. Zoom out to the global stage. The ICAO reports that the worldwide accident rate is climbing again. For decades, aviation has prided itself on bending the curve downward every year, safer than one before. But now, the headline is bending the wrong way. And so, what does a rising global accident rate really mean? It means one number we've always held sacred, the proof that every year was safer than the last, and is bending the wrong direction now. For decades, we've been improving on systems and culture, and It's it's now a promise that seems to be slipping. And that should send a chill down the spine for anyone who boards an airplane, because the whole promise of trust in this industry, it really rests on the curve pointing down. And there's a critical question here. Is this a technology problem or a human problem? It's not the airplanes. They're more advanced. They're more reliable. They're more redundant than any time else in history. The weak link isn't the hardware. It's us. It's the fatigue. It's the pressure. It's the regulators stretched too thin and underfunded. It's mechanics rushing through tasks without backup. It's airlines that reward on-time performance over thorough inspections. In short, we're failing the technology, not the other way around. It's the best way I can say it. And can this industry really afford to treat safety like a cost center? Absolutely not. Prevention will always be cheaper than the price of an accident. And the cost isn't just dollars, it's measured in lives and reputations destroyed in the invisible contract between the flying public and the industry. That stepping onto an airplane isn't a gamble with fate, but a guarantee that discipline and vigilance stand between you and your, a disaster. At the end, the cracks that bring down the plane aren't just in the metal, physical cracks in metal. It's people, it's systems. They're in logbooks, signed off too quickly. And if we don't confront them, if we don't repair those, cultural fractures with the same urgency that we do when we fix hardware, then that curve will keep bending in the wrong direction, And that's a real alarm bell for decades. Aviation's story was just of progress, safer skies every year, fewer accidents, In 2024 alone, there were 95 accidents, up from 66 the year before, and 296 fatalities compared to 72 the year prior. Every decimal matters in this industry. Each uptick in a warning, trends ignored become tragedies repeated. So who really owns the responsibility for the safety? Regulators? The airlines? The mechanics? The truth is really all of them. The regulators write the rules, the airlines manage the costs, the mechanic signs the logbook. That signature isn't routine, it's sacred. It ties the mechanic, to the aircraft. It's part of your integrity to the lives of the people that are about to board that aircraft that you work so hard on. When we have that chain of responsibility break, when regulators shrug, airlines push, mechanics feel powerless, the system collapses. The truth is safety isn't owned by just one group. Regulators, may be one mechanics, but it's a group. It's a group effort, not just one. Collectively, listen. We cover so much and so many different things happening in aviation. But what do all those stories have in common together? The panel blowout at 16,000 feet, toxic fumes in cabins, lithium batteries burning mid-flight, a wheel rolling down the runway, cracks creeping in rotor blades, logbooks filed with repeat snags. And of course, now we have a rising global accident rate. They're all different failures, different machines, different countries, but every one of them points to the same truth, my friends. Aviation safety is fragile, and it isn't automatic. It's built, maintained, and defended by the people who refuse shortcuts. The mechanic who takes one more look, the inspector who asks one more question, that regulator who says no when it's easier to say yes. You know, every rivet, every torque, every signature in a logbook is a promise. It's a promise that when passengers close their eyes on takeoff, they'll open them again on landing. That promise doesn't live in the headlines or in FAA press releases. It lives in the hangars, the ramps, and in the midnight shifts where tired mechanics keep the world in the air. You know, and that's the hidden truth of aviation. Safety isn't free. It costs vigilance. It costs discipline. It costs saying not yet when the schedule screams now. You know, so next time you're on board a plane, you got to remember it's not luck keeping you safe. It's people. People they carry a sacred responsibility every single day. And as long as that chain holds, aviation remains the safest way to travel. But if we ever let that chain corrode, the sky is going to remind us. We got to stay sharp, stay safe, and remember, in aviation, there's no shortcuts. And that about wraps it up this return episode of the COTACast. Thanks for, it's a new setup. I have to kind of get used to it. But thanks for tuning in to the COTACast, powered by Craft of the Air. If you're in need of expert guidance, aircraft support, or tailored consulting, schedule your free consultation today at www.craftoftheair.com. Again, that's www.craftoftheair.com. Stay ahead of the conversation. Follow us on Instagram, Twitter, YouTube with the hashtag COTACast for the latest aviation insights, stories, and updates. And remember, the COTACast is always streaming on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you may listen. That about wraps. It's been a long day. That about wraps up. We just had to film this episode, and I just had to film it on one take. Just like this. Just straight up me, awake for a day working, coming home, speaking to you guys about how I feel about these topics. But that about wraps it up for this episode of COTACast. We will see you the same time next week, and we hope that you guys have a great weekend. Be safe, and we'll be seeing you soon.